thank you. So Matt Howard with the Department of Transportation was going to co-present with me today, but unfortunately he had to leave early. So Dr. Daniel Olson with the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources is going to help me present today. But I do want to acknowledge that in Utah, we do have an incredible partnership between the Department of Transportation and the Division of Wildlife. It's longstanding. We meet very closely at the statewide level and at the regional level. And I just think it's really important to acknowledge all the partnerships. I see people from Utah have been involved with several of our projects across the state. So super excited about the partnerships that we have in Utah. So I'm Makeda Hanson. I'm the Wildlife Migration Initiative Coordinator for the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. And the Wildlife Migration Initiative was started in 2018 in Utah to document, preserve, and enhance wildlife movement and connectivity across the state. So for those of you who may not be familiar with where Utah is, we're in the Intermountain West of the United States. We have a population of about 3.5 million people in Utah. We have expansive growth similar to Idaho, where our annual growth rate is about 1.5%. 20 years ago, our average mileage traveled in Utah was 25 million miles. We're currently at 35 million miles of road traveled every year. And for context, that's about 15,000 miles a year for every driver in Utah. So we see a lot of traffic in the state. We have a lot of interest in further growth from our state, including expanding housing, energy, all sorts of different recreation, which all drives our economy. So we have a lot of interest and growth in the state of Utah. So first, when it comes to documenting wildlife, in 2014, we started collaring animals in Utah with GPS-enabled collars. In 2018, the Migration Initiative was started, and credit to Dr. Daniel Olson, he put a lot of work into developing our wildlife tracker system. To date, we have over 13,000 individual animals that have been included in our wildlife tracker database, and that includes over 70 million location points. So this just shows kind of currently active animals, their last location, all the different colors are a different species. So we have over 30 different species in the database. Of all the wildlife, about half of them were deer, collared deer. So we've had about 7,000 deer collared in the state over the years, which gives us a lot of information on where these animals are moving. There's a lot of different features in the wildlife tracker database, obviously individual animal locations. We also can animate how they move. We can do track lines, and then also we can put geofences up. And so that can be really valuable when we're looking at a roadway to know what time of year animals are crossing. We can look at how they're interacting with the road. These GPS collars get points about every 2 hours, so you can see how long they're hanging on a road before they're willing to cross. So these are the migration corridors that have been mapped throughout Utah. Based on that information, the light blue areas are mule deer habitat across the state, and then those darker blue areas are where our cities and towns are. And so Utah is kind of unique compared to surrounding states like Wyoming in that our mule deer habitat is kind of fragmented. We have such big desert landscapes in Utah, and so we kind of have this like backbone of mule deer habitat, and then these little islands of mule deer habitat throughout the state that are separated by big expanses of desert. So in comparison, our longest migration routes in Utah are like 70 miles, but most of them are under 30 when it comes to migrating deer, at least. And so we see a lot of elevational migrations as opposed to long longitudinal migrations like other states. So the other tiers of the Migration Initiative are preservation and enhancement. So when that comes to roads specifically, we want to preserve, like you see in the left, where we already have animals that are crossing those roadways. And then we want to enhance where we have major barriers to wildlife movement and connectivity. So those are kind of two examples. The red are major interstates, and then the black are major highways. So in mule deer habitat alone, we have 7,000 miles of major highways or interstates bisecting critical mule deer habitat. In the state of Utah, we have over 100,000 miles of road. So a lot of fragmentation on the landscape. Similar to other states, we also have a roadkill reporter system in Utah. This is a public system, and then we also have a separate system to record pickups by UDOT contractors UDOT personnel and then Division of Wildlife personnel. Since 2005, we have reported over 100,000 locations of mule deer carcasses. As you all know, this is only a fraction of what's actually occurring on the landscape. But we've seen a lot of success with the public engaging in this since it's been online for 2 years. So we're excited to see the public take an interest in this and have a way to document those. In addition to wildlife roadkill collisions, we also have our crash data. On average, there's about 2,000 to 3,000 crashes documented for UDOT. This can sometimes be subjective based on who cares enough about their car and the damage to say that they hit a deer. So that can sometimes be a little bit difficult to determine, but it's a good data set for us to figure out where to prioritize. So in Utah, we have been building wildlife crossings since 1975. The first wildlife crossing overpass was in Utah in 1975, and since then we have installed in partnership with UDOT 60 wildlife crossings. So those are crossings that were designed specifically for wildlife movement and connectivity. Really quickly, I presented on this project back in the 2021 ICOET conference. And so we on US 191, which is in the Monticello area, southeastern Utah, it connects the areas between like Arches National Park, Canyons National Park, and then the Bears Ears National Monument. So we see a lot of traffic there from tourists, in addition to our residents of the state. So we installed one below pipe arch structure in 2016, and then another in 2019, and a box culvert in 2019 as well. So just what I wanted to show here is how that has changed the hotspots in the state, or in that area. And so you can see prior to the installation of those structures, we had hotspots. The red dots with the yellow circles are where those crossings are. And then you can see that we're not seeing those same numbers of collisions in those areas. We do probably have some end of fence issues, and then the complications of just cities and people, difficult to kind of fence those areas off in your town. But it's good to see that those have been successful in reducing wildlife vehicle collisions. But when it comes to wildlife migration and connectivity, it goes well beyond what's happening on the road. We also want to see how those animals are able to move across the landscape. Because even where we have barriers, we obviously see that animals are getting hit on the roadways, but they still don't have connectivity. And so it's important to maintain connectivity where it is, and also to make sure that those animals that are really wanting to be migrators aren't the ones that are always getting killed. So in the future, 30 years from now, those animals that are willing to make those journeys are able to continue. So really quickly, this is just what it looked like, wildlife movement looked like prior to the installation of those structures and after. So sometimes we hear from the public that we cut off their migration, but the data that we have from GPS collars shows that they were still able to access all the areas that they had migrated prior to the installation of that fencing and those structures, and that we've maintained connectivity in that area. So really excited to see that. Daniel?
Thanks, Makeda. So I'm not Matt Howard, as Makeda mentioned. Matt had to fly out earlier this morning, so I got to fill in for him. Matt's a really good colleague of ours at the Department of Transportation. And so this is part 2 of our presentation on Utah. We're going to talk about a couple projects that recently got funded that will be happening that we're excited about. But before we get started, Matt had one important message he wanted me to tell you right off the bat. He said there's an unfortunate stereotype going around in Utah that if you drive by a UDOT construction site, you'll see a bunch of people in vests standing around watching one person work. And he said that's not true. If you look at this picture, you see a group of people standing around and nobody's working. So, but actually, in reality, our Department of Transportation is amazing. They only have 2,000 people. Utah is growing like crazy. We're busting at the seams right now, and they're trying to accommodate all of the transportation needs in the state. And they just do a great job of making sure we have good roads. If you've driven on in Utah, we have really good roads and bridges. And it's also an agency that's full of people that hunt and fish and love wildlife. And they've been just a really great partner for us to collaborate on these important wildlife projects. So the first one I'm going to talk about is a project that we were notified in January, got funded. So this was a grant application that was submitted for the RAISE program, and that's an infrastructure program. And this is what the cover of our grant looks like. I just Googled the program this morning. It looks like it's been rebranded as the BUILD program. So if you guys want to go online and try to find it, that's what it's called now. But what we did for this grant application is we took several data sets to try to create a compelling story of why this section of road needed to be worked on. So we looked at crash data, which Makeda mentioned earlier. So these are accident reports that law enforcement are called to. And then we also looked at carcass data. So UDOT has contractors that travel this stretch of highway every week, and they document all the carcass locations. So when we look at these two data sets together, they're kind of showing the same message. Lots of wildlife vehicle collisions all throughout this 23-mile stretch of highway. We also looked at the migration data that we had collected in that area. So as Makeda mentioned, these migration corridor maps, the red areas are high-use migration corridors, and the yellow are lower-use corridors. And then this is hard to see on this map, but the highway is running through the center of that. And then the vehicle collision hotspots, the hotspots are in the lighter colors, the yellow hotspots, and then the red is the lower spot. So when we combine the data sets, we can see that we could potentially have movement and connectivity issues occurring on this highway. It's the traffic volumes are about 7,000 vehicles per day. It's a really rural landscape with lots of wildlife, but it's got a lot of oil trucks on it, and they are just flying through the stretch of highway. They can't avoid wildlife very easily, and so we have a lot of deer and elk being killed. So that's kind of a picture of kind of what it looks like out in that area. And then the other important thing about this project is that the reason why we have so many wildlife in this area is it's a really important winter range for big game. So our deer and elk are all flooding into this area during the winter, and the highway runs right through the center of it. It's also very close to 5 different wildlife management areas that our agency manages. These properties were bought specifically to protect big game in the winter. And so we're really excited about this project because we're maintaining connectivity between all these wildlife areas and hopefully increasing survival over the winter. Okay. All right, so the second project that got funded that we're working on is a project in southern Utah, near the Arizona-Utah border, near Kanab, if you've been down in that area. This project was funded through the Wildlife Crossing Pilot Program. We got $5.5 million to work on this area. This area has a lot of history. So one of our most important mule deer herds travels across this highway and during their seasonal migration. Some of these animals are moving 60, 70 miles. They're coming out of the Bryce Canyon area, moving south across this highway down to the border area where they winter on both sides of the Utah-Arizona border. It's been a hotspot for many years. We started doing mitigation work in 2012. So there's a project that added 3 underpass crossing structures in this area and tied into 4 existing structures. After that mitigation was done, Patty Kramer did some monitoring to see how the structures are being used. And she documented in 5 years, she documented 78,000 successful crossings through those structures. So we just have thousands of deer moving across this highway. The project that got funded through the Wildlife Crossing Pilot Program is to extend the mitigation in this area. So we're going to be working farther to the west and connect into that existing mitigation. And so there'll be 3 new underpasses, and we're going to tie into 1 existing bridge. The bridge was originally we were going to plan to replace that bridge, but we put cameras on it to see if we had wildlife movement occurring there, and we do, which was fortunate. So that bridge can stay intact. And we have a short video to show you some of the wildlife that's using this existing bridge even without exclusion fencing. Okay, so yeah, we're just excited to be able to work on these projects. These are going to be a couple of really great projects in Utah. We appreciate everybody that's helped with them in Utah. We have a grant writer at the Department of Transportation that's been really helpful in getting these projects over the hump for us. I feel like as agency staff, we have a lot of good ideas, but not a lot of time to implement all those good ideas. And having a grant writer that you can say, okay, this is what we want to go after to help us has been really valuable. And that's the end of our presentation today, and happy to address any questions.
We will run into a couple of questions to Utah, and then we'll open it back up for
Thank you. I have two questions that are related. One is, I saw for the phase two, there's one proposed construction on private land. So maybe you could speak more to if I read it correctly. And then also, for talking about past near barriers, when there's those energy units and there's a lot of like private lands, I'm assuming are driveways. Has there been any pushback from the community or have it been supportive of the public?
I'm sorry, I had a hard time hearing the first part of your question.
In the phase two, where you were showing the one bridge and the three new underpasses, there's one of those underpasses on private land.
Not sure where we are.
I think, yeah, I think that's correct. So one of those will have a connection to private land. We're talking with the landowner right now to try to acquire an easement for that property. That's not an area that will likely get developed in the near future, but we definitely want to try to make sure that doesn't happen at some point in the future. You're welcome.
Then in that area near the Bears Ears, that was something when we started that project back in 2016 that we definitely could have done a better job at. We have both resident and migratory deer there, and there's lots of private landowners, and it is a lot of dry land farming. And so when we did put those wildlife underpasses in, it kind of funneled them onto one landowner dealing with depredation issues as opposed to multiple. So definitely a lesson learned, but overall we've had a lot of support from the local community because mule deer and elk are like so amazing in Utah to everyone in Utah, and we get a lot of funding to support anything to protect and enhance populations there. So overall, the public has been pretty supportive, but definitely something to consider that we probably should have put some more thought into in that area. So we, as the state of Utah, didn't do any public meetings, but we partnered with a lot of local people in that area. So we had the Sportsman Fish and Wildlife had a chapter in the area, so they really did the networking with their local membership. And then in addition, we worked with like the Highway Patrol and San Juan County. And so we really relied on them to work with the people that they had relationships with, and they built that trust and respect. We definitely do have that with the agency, but sometimes there's better avenues than having us talk directly to them about those issues. And so the county was really supportive in helping us build those connections.
Yes, thank you for your presentation today. I'm curious about the carcass collection data set. You indicated that you had that contract out for her organization. What's your instructions to them when it comes to reporting strikes or carcasses? Everything they touch or anything they see?
Okay, so that's a really good question. We've been fortunate for, I think it's been since about 2005, our Department of Transportation has been hiring contractors to cover certain routes. They don't cover every state route, but they are, where we do have vehicle collision problems, there's usually a contract there to monitor that. And they have to drive once or twice a week down that route, and they're usually picking up the carcass and removing it. And at the same time, they use the app that Makeda showed you guys to report that data. So we know that it's not the same animal being reported twice when it comes in from our contractors. We know that's only represents one animal. So that's a data set we rely on pretty heavily. And was there a second part to your question that I missed?
Your instructions to them, we have gaps in our data in my district because unless they physically handle the animal, it doesn't get reported. If they strike an animal, it's tossed off the roadway, or it makes it on the roadway on its own. Doesn't get reported, but that is basically points in our data.
Yeah, so the scenario I described was in a perfect world. In reality, our contractors, there's varying levels of effort depending on who's doing it, and they don't always do it how we ask them to do it. So yeah, we have issues with our data set as well. Yeah.
All right, so we'll keep taking questions because we. Yes. Oh, should we appropriate the, I, because I asked him, I didn't know. Okay, so we'll have a little bit, people trying to say something. Question, because we still have time, I think, too, so, we'll go back here.
Actually, I comment on the question, comment to the it's a really good metaphor for talking about friendship. And how when you show up and my question is for you talked about data sets that you use using the white tech here, that was mostly resident or an application you can. And I know a lot of us are used to finding data sets and release across society is that fine scale changes all that. I'm just wondering if you could speak to maybe some challenges regarding society and you don't have that fine scale data. And how that increase the animals across the can potentially change.
Yeah, so I think the question was speak to the white-tailed deer and how we kind of chose those spots because the white-tailed deer is a resident herd and they're not migrating, right? Did I understand that right? So yeah, one of the big problems in the Garwood-Sago corridor I can't remember if I mentioned this or not, is that much of the corridor is private lands adjacent to US 95. So, obviously you can't control, there's zoning, planning and zoning, obviously, but you can't control development to some extent there. And so a lot of the corridor has changed just in the last 20 years from the last wildlife movement report. And so ITD wanted to take a fresh look based on, now on that, and again, see where those animals were with a camera trap study, look at the conflict data, and kind of get a fresh picture now on what to do moving forward. But that is a problem, is there's so much development right now in North Idaho that things are rapidly changing. And we, talked with the district about that. It's like, hey, look, here's our results in 2024, 2025, right? But if more development occurs and North Idaho keeps blowing up, like this theoretically could be invalid, in another 5 or 10 years. So that's a challenge.
I mean, and I would just like some suggestions on how there might be coordination across state boundaries. Yeah, we all our
One thing I wanted to mention, we do have funding for another project on I-84, which is kind of on the boundary there between Idaho and Utah. And when it goes back to partnership, I think one thing to really highlight is Utah recently applied for and received a grant for range improvements in those areas, including a study to look at where wildlife vehicle collisions are occurring and develop some mitigation recommendations on I-84. And the director of the Idaho Fish and Game actually wrote a letter of support for Utah's grant application in order to get funding to do that project. And so I don't know that I have other recommendations other than I really want to highlight that I thought that was super powerful that Idaho's director was willing to provide a letter of support for a grant that Utah was going after. And we definitely have data that shows wildlife are crossing that boundary in that area. I don't know, Danny, if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I think one way we partnered with other states is through collaring animals. So the Poncegat mule deer herd that I mentioned, we share those deer with Arizona. So when we were trying to understand those migration corridors better, we contacted our colleagues at Arizona Game and Fish, and they helped us with that capture. They helped provide collars. We captured animals on both sides of the border, which was really cool. We got some great data from that. We saw animals going from Arizona into Utah. We also saw animals going from the border area down to the Grand Canyon area. So really expanded what we knew about those animals. We also collaborated with Wyoming Game and Fish in the Uintas to capture animals that we knew were moving between Utah and Wyoming. So that's been one of the ways I can think of that we've collaborated with other states to preserve connectivity.
Yeah, and I had a question starting with the camera question of the study and the value added of that effort, because of course it's a lot of efforts away from us and data and evaluate that, and it's that it did line up with the law that but 44 snapshots agree to my photos, and I guess I'm just wondering, beyond like having photos, which does have its own value for sure, how much you felt that is an important purpose. Awesome.
Yeah, so I think the question was, how much did we value the camera trap photos, right, in the study, and how did that work and everything? So since we didn't have the telemetry data, I think the camera trap data ended up being, a pretty important piece of our study. Just again, to see where the animals were within the corridor, where they were hanging out. And ultimately what we ended up doing was we didn't prioritize the final 5 locations that we found, but we kind of looked at everything as more of a qualitative viewpoint and said, hey, look, these are the areas that the camera drop photos are showing high animal movements. They align really, really nicely in a lot of the corridor areas with the linkage mapper. And that's where we ended up, where those data sets kind of converged to make those final recommendations. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Do you have, I guess you have more specific, like, okay. We can talk more afterwards too.
My question is also for Idaho, your numbers from October, November, December are your highest on your cameras, which I presume also coincided with the snow in the panhandle. Your snow depth going to be an issue for underpasses.
For what, sorry?
For underpasses, snow depth, plugging up your underpasses.
We do get quite a bit of snow in North Idaho. Coeur d'Alene, for instance, averages about 70 inches a year total. So I don't think it would be so prohibitive that it would impact the underpasses. All of our underpasses, we were looking at, in that 15, 16 foot headroom amount. So I don't think that would be a big factor in my opinion. I don't, Mark, if you have a different opinion on that, but.
No, I agree with that. We went out there every month to check in assessment cars on and how much snow did you know?
Yeah, that's a great point too. We did, let's see, so the 2022-2023 snow year was not very good in terms of hitting our numbers. It was a low snow year. We had, I think, probably 1 or 2 months where it was challenging to go out and swap cards where we had 2+ feet of snow on the ground. But aside from that, it wasn't too bad. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
All right, we're gonna end it there. Let's thank our presenters.